Good morning. So today we're going to go through chapter 6 and a couple of verses of 7. Let me say the following. Chapter 6 is rather short, only 12 verses. Let me also add that it is very difficult. If you've got the booklets that we've been using, there are a number of footnotes that tell us we need an emendation here, or not very clear what it's talking about, or, et cetera, et cetera. And we've seen that before, and again, in chapter 6, we see it again. Why this is the case, again, last week we said, perhaps it's that there were mistakes made in the transmission of the Hebrew, or perhaps the nature of the language changed. After all, we're talking about going back some 2,200 years, and meanings of words and idioms may have changed over the course of time. That's another possibility. Third thing that I have to tell you is that once again, we're in the realm of really being depressing kind of stuff. And again, it's important to remember that here is an author who's conveying these ideas to us. What was the matter with him? What was going on in his life? Why did he believe all these things? And very important for us to remember that when we read this, we're reading one man's opinion, not this is what Judaism says. Okay? For whatever reasons, and we'll get to that as we complete the book, the rabbis felt this is a book that should be in the Bible. And they also felt this is a book that should be read every Sukkot, which was the happiest of all the festivals in antiquity. So we'll have to deal with that question as well. But again, towards the end of the class today, there's going to be some very interesting and hopefully powerful things that we share from the Midrash. But let's dive into chapter 6 of the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and see what we've got. Again, in the books, we're on page 66. And he says as follows, Yesh ra'ah asher ra'iti tachat hashamash. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun. V'rabahi al ha'adam. And it is a grave one for man. What is the great evil? That God sometimes grants a man riches, property, and wealth, so that he does not want for anything his appetite may crave. But God does not permit him to enjoy it. Instead, a stranger will enjoy it. So we've seen this idea before, that you work so hard your whole life to acquire property and riches and wealth, and what happens? You die of a heart attack, or you're robbed, and you lose, your house burns down, you lose all those things. So we wonder, was Kohelet a man in this situation, or was he just on the sidelines and he saw this happen to people he knew, or did this happen to him himself, and therefore he's sort of complaining about it now? So we continue with verse 3. Even if a man should beget 100 children and live many years, no matter how many the days of his years may come to, if his gullet is not sated through his wealth, I say the stillbirth, though it was not even accorded a burial, is more fortunate than he. Couple of things we need to talk about. What's this word gullet? And the Hebrew word is nephesh. We generally translate the word nephesh as soul. But in the Bible, nephesh generally means your throat, or as they translate it here, gullet, right? The idea that you keep swallowing things, hopefully to satisfy your tongue and your palate and your stomach, but the more that you pile in, you really are not satisfying yourself at all. Goes in one end, goes out the other, what are you left with? To be rather crude about it. So we're told, I say, no matter how much you have, no matter how much you stuff yourself with, I say the stillbirth, though it was not even accorded a burial, and you can see from the footnote, stillbirths were cast into pits or hidden in the ground in no recognizable graves. Today, either, God forbid, somebody has a stillborn. From a halachic point of view, the fetus, the child, when born, should be accorded a regular burial. There isn't shiva, there isn't mourning, but the body of the stillborn should be buried in a cemetery. It used to be, for people who were not religious and following Jewish law, that this was so painful and so difficult that ultimately, they didn't even want to think about it or know about it, and the hospital would basically dispose of the remains. But again, from a halachic point of view, the stillborn should be buried. We find out that in Kohelet's day, the idea was there wasn't a formal grave. The body was dumped into a pit. But the stillborn seems to be more fortunate than a man who lives to be 80, 100, and was very wealthy. Somebody who was born and never even, lived a moment is more fortunate than that guy. So we're getting back to the same idea that we've seen from Kohelet before. Verse 4, though it comes into futility and departs into darkness, and its very name is covered with darkness, though it has never seen or experienced the sun, it, meaning the stillborn, it is better off than he. Yes, even if the other lived 1,000 years twice over, but never had his fill of enjoyment. For are not both of them bound for the same place? And again, very morbid, the idea, what's the point of living for 70, 80 years? You're never satisfied. You're worse off than the stillborn, at least, who didn't have the disappointment. Well, you could make the case the other way around. You could say, but the stillborn didn't have any of the moments of joy that somebody who was born and lived had. But, half the glass half empty or half full, to Kohelet, it's always empty, not even half full. Verse 7, all of a man's earning is for the sake of his mouth. Everything that you work for so that you could feed yourself, so that you could stuff yourself, right? Put it into your mouth. And then for the sake of his mouth, yet his gullet is not sated, no matter what. And you can see in the footnote at the bottom, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. The emendation, they're trying their best to figure out what could he have been talking about? What did he mean? Maybe it's, and if the gullet is not sated, what advantage has the wise man over the fool, he who knows how to get on in life over the pauper? Okay, so that's their attempt to try to make some sense here. Verse 8, what advantage then has the wise man over the fool? What advantage has the pauper who knows how to get on in life? So, You see difficult verses, we don't know really what he had in mind. Verse 9, is the feasting of the eyes more important than the pursuit of desire? That too is futility and pursuit of wind. Verse 10, whatever happens, it was designated long ago, and it was known that it would happen. As for man, he cannot contend with what is stronger than he. Often, much talk means much futility. How does it benefit a man? Who can possibly know what is best for a man to do in life, the few days of his fleeting life? For who can tell him what the future holds for him under the sun? So those are the verses, the few verses of chapter 6. And while a lot of the sentences are not clear, we certainly get the gist of what he's talking about. The notion that we've got, we're here, we're gone, what difference does it make because you're going to be disappointed no matter what happens. Okay, so far, not too much different. So now we come to chapter 7, and it's a longer chapter, but we're only going to do a few verses. I want to concentrate more on the midrash, the midrashic understanding of these early verses in chapter 7. So here we begin with what seems to be a proverb. Now, whether Kohelet invented it or whether it was a well-known proverb that he's simply using because he wants to make a point about it, that we'll never really know. But I want you to listen in chapter 7 to the first half a sentence. Tov Shem Mishemen Tov. So you've got 4 words there, and there's something very clever from a literary point of view. Right? We've got 4 words. The first word and the last word is tov, meaning good. And then the middle 2 words are sort of a pun. Shem, which means name, and shemen, which means oil. Now, a word about oil. We're not talking about motor oil. We're not talking about cooking oil. Remember that 3,000 years ago, we didn't have indoor plumbing. There was no such thing as soap as we now know it. People rarely bathed. People smelled. They stunk. You didn't wash very often. So, and not only your body, but your hair. Okay, so imagine if a month goes by and people haven't had the ability to be in the water, to wash up, or to wash their hair. You can imagine the state of hygiene that people were in. What were people going to do? There wasn't running water. If there was, a river nearby or a well, probably wasn't close by. So ultimately, in order to cover the smells of the body, people would use oil, and they would rub their bodies in oil. The oil would have a fragrance to it, and that would cover up the stink of the human body. And you can imagine in the hair, you didn't shampoo your hair daily, didn't even do it once a week. So by putting oil through your hair, it probably got rid of some of the dirt, some of the smell of the hair. So here we're being told, Tov Shem Mishemen Tov. And again, that pun in the middle here, Shem and Shemen, name and oil. A good name is better than fragrant oil. Fragrant oil, we assume, poor people probably couldn't afford it. It was something too steep in price and rare for them. Rich people, which is who Kohelet is probably dealing with, he was probably in that upper class, right? Rich people had shemen tov. They had this fragrant oil. Their wealth enabled them to have this perfume, which means they didn't stink so much as poor people did. So ultimately, here is a kind of a message. A good name is better than fragrant oil. So the idea is that all your money and all your wealth, what is it going to do? Having a good name, a good reputation is better than all the money and all the things that your money can buy. So first, I want to share with you this passage from Kohelet Rabbah. Remember, the Midrash were the rabbinic commentaries on the Bible. We've said Kohelet is maybe 300, 200 BCE. The Midrash maybe 100, 200, 300, 400, etc. CE, so it's several hundred years after Kohelet wrote. The Midrash are the commentaries of the rabbis on the Bible. The most famous is Midrash Rabbah, which is actually Midrashim, collections of Midrashim, of commentaries by the rabbis to the 5 books of Moses, as well as to the 5 Megillot. So we've got Midrash Rabbah to Kohelet, known as Kohelet Rabbah. And this is what the rabbis write. A good name is better than good oil. Good oil flows downward, while a good name ascends. Okay, your name will go up, bring you up, whereas oil, you pour it, it goes straight down. Good oil is transient, while a good name endures forever. You've got a good reputation, it's always going to be there. Whereas oil will eventually become no good. Good oil is spent, while a good name is not spent. You use the oil and it's gone. You can't use it again. But a good name is never gone. It's always there. Good oil is bought with money, while a good name is free of cost. Okay? You don't need to be rich to get a good reputation. Good oil is applicable only to the living, while a good name is applicable to the living and the dead. Okay? So the idea, a dead person, even after they're gone, their reputation stays. Good oil can only be acquired by the rich, costs a lot of money, while a good name can be acquired by poor and rich. The scent of good oil is diffused from the bedchamber to the dining hall, while a good name is diffused from one end of the world to the other. How far do you think that perfume is going to work? Only from here to there. But a good name, that can take you to the end. Reputation can go from one end of the earth to the other. Good oil falls upon a dead body and becomes rancid. As it is said in Ecclesiastes later in chapter 10, we're going to read the following verse. Dead flies make the ointment of the perfumer fetid and putrid, while a good name falls upon a dead person and does not become putrid, as it says in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 4, verse 34, and he went up and lay upon the child, and he stretched himself upon him. This is the story of Elisha and the dead child who he was able to miraculously bring back to life. Elisha had a good reputation and a good name, And so when he came in contact with the dead child, he was able to resurrect the child, bring the child back to life. Good oil falls upon water and it's washed away. Oil and water, of course, don't mix. While a good name falls upon water and is not washed away, as it is said. Now, how are you going to prove this from a verse from the Bible? And the Lord spoke unto the fish, and it vomited out Jonah upon dry land. Jonah, who possessed a good name, was not destroyed by being cast into the sea. Good oil is burnt when it falls upon fire, but a good name falls upon fire without being burnt, as it is written. And here we go to the book of Daniel and the story of the three men in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth out of the midst of the oven, out of the fiery furnace. Okay, so we have that idea of look at this clever, cute teaching that the rabbis do, proving by all these examples how a good reputation is better than good oil. Tov shem mishemen tov. And once again, this notion that you strive, you struggle your whole life to get money to buy you things, and they're not as precious or as worthwhile as somebody who has a good reputation. How do you get a good reputation? By being kind, by doing mitzvot, by doing acts of charity. Those are the things that ultimately come back and stay with you forever. And then the second half of our verse, chapter 7, verse 1, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. That's also, a stunning statement. Second half in the Hebrew, V'yom hamavet miyom hivaldo. The day you die is better than the day you were born. What possibly could that be all about? So once again, the rabbis are going to give us their interpretation. So we'll go back to the Midrash, and here's what we have. A good name is better than precious oil, and the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. So here we go. When a person is born, he is designated for death. As soon as you're born, it's only a matter, the clock is ticking. It's only a matter of time until you die. It could be moments, it could be, even if it's 100 years, you know where you're going to end up, right, with death. When he dies, he is designated for life in the world to come. So that's another reason that the day of death is better than the day of birth. When you're born, the clock is ticking until you die. You're just waiting. But when you die, it's immediate that you're going to go to a better place. So again, we see here that by this point, Jews, or at least Kohelet, believed that there was a world to come and that we could look forward to something better in the next world than we can in this particular world. When a person is born, all rejoice, but when he dies, all weep. So that seems to be true. But the rabbis say it should not be so. People have got it backwards. But when a person is born, there should be no rejoicing over him, because it is not known in what class he will stand by reason of his actions, whether righteous or wicked, good or bad. Hitler is born and everybody's happy. No, you need to wait. How's this little baby going to turn out? Is the birth of this baby going to be cause for rejoicing, or maybe not? Right? When he dies, however, there is cause for rejoicing if he departs with a good name and leaves the world in peace. So again, a very interesting perspective. When the baby's born, you don't know what's going to become. Will the baby suffer, or will the baby, have a pretty good life? Will the baby end up growing up to do good things, or will the baby end up growing up to do things that are going to be a curse to everyone the baby comes in contact with? And then we have a very famous and very moving parable. In Hebrew, we refer to it as a mashal, a parable. It is as if there were two ocean-going ships, one leaving the harbor and the other entering it. As the one sailed out of the harbor, all rejoiced. So imagine, the ship is going on the cruise, and people are on the ship, and they're all looking down, and all the people who came to wave goodbye, they're all cheering, and isn't this wonderful? The cruise is starting, and imagine all the great things that await the people on this ship and all the places that they're going to go to. But none displayed any joy over the one which was entering the harbor. So you've got the ship that comes in, and you've got the workers who are there ready to tie up the ship, unload it, bring people off. But which one, in reality, most of the time, has the people waving and saying goodbye and cheering as the ship goes off? Not so much when the ship comes back. But listen to this. A shrewd man was there. As one ship is going out, people are cheering, and the other ship comes in, and people, nobody's there to welcome him. Shrewd man was there, and he said to the people, I take the opposite view to you. There is no cause to rejoice over the ship which is leaving the harbor, because nobody knows what will be its plight, what seas and storms it may encounter. Remember, back in those days, if the ocean and the waves and the storms didn't get you, there was a very good chance that the pirates would. Okay? But when it enters the harbor, all have occasion to rejoice, since it has come in safely. So it's a beautiful idea that if it was ships, maybe we've got this backwards. And maybe the mashal, the parable, applies to people, not just to ships. Similarly, when a person dies, all should rejoice and offer thanks that he departed from the world with a good name and in peace. That is what Solomon said, meaning Kohelet. The rabbis assumed it was Solomon who wrote the book, when he said, and the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. So, look, we've all been at funerals, and mostly they are very sad affairs. But occasionally, when somebody has lived a good and a full life, we say at the funeral, today we're not here to mourn, but to celebrate a life. And especially if somebody has lived a full life, and maybe even if they were suffering at the end, we sometimes see that death can be, we're not so broken-hearted that they passed away. Maybe we are thankful that their suffering is over. But Kohelet goes beyond just that, which is maybe the way we would look at it. He says, you're born, who knows what suffering you're going to have, who knows what you're going to accomplish or not in life. But when you die, you're going to a better place, and there's no more suffering here on earth. Sounds to me, at least, a little bit more like what Christians would say at the funeral. At a very tragic funeral, you could have the priest or the minister say, we shouldn't be upset, they're in a better place. They're now with Jesus. They're now with their relatives. Jews don't really believe that or buy into it. For us, today at least, it's all about this life and the here and now. And so if you're gone, it's a tragedy, because all that we can be assured of is no longer here. So that's very different from the way that Christians look at life and death. So Kohelet, his view is a different one than the way most of us would think about life and death, and when to be happy and when to be sad. When a baby is born, we're anxious, we're worried. That's not how we look at it. Birth is always a great thing, even though we know there's a lot of tsuris and trouble ahead. But to him, when somebody dies, that's cause for, I wouldn't say rejoicing, but a sense that their trouble is over and they're going to a better place. And then we come to verse 2, which is also a stunning statement. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. For that is the end of every man, and a living one should take it to heart. Again, better to go to a shiva house or to a wedding. We wouldn't even ask the question or think about it twice. But Kohelet gives us the answer that we're not expecting. Better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. What does he have in mind here? So let's see what the rabbis offer about this. Why? Because the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. For if one mourns, in other words, takes to heart the lessons to be learnt in the time of bereavement, the vanity of worldly things, and the virtue of humility. You can learn a lot, by going to a shiva house, by going to a funeral. You remind yourself, I'm not going to be here very long. I better not waste my time, or I better not use my time trying to gather things that I'll never be able to take with me. So he makes the case, this is after all wisdom literature. What wisdom can we learn by going to a funeral? And indeed, I think seriously, there's a lot you can learn by going to a funeral. For if one mourns, the Holy One, blessed be he, causes him to rejoice. As it is said, the humble also shall increase their joy in the Lord. Quoting from the book of Isaiah 29. Another interpretation of it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. It is better to follow a line of conduct, in other words, the way you behave, wherein there is recompense, than one in which there may be no recompense. In other words, since all have to die, to do an act of kindness will lead to a similar consideration being paid to the doer when he dies. But there can be no such certainty of a similar consideration in the case of going to a house of feasting. In other words, if you make a shiva call, or you attend a funeral, or you go to the cemetery and you help, people are going to say, "That was so nice of them to have come to the funeral. That was so nice of them to help with the burial at the cemetery. That was so nice of them to have come to the shiva house." And years later, when that person dies, who did all these mitzvahs, then people are going to say, "You know what, I'm going to pay them back. I'm going to go to their funeral. I'm going to help bury them. I'm going to try to comfort their mourners," right? So you get paid back by the kindness of going to a house of mourning. Whereas you go to a birthday party or you go to a wedding, people aren't necessarily going to say, "You know, they came to our wedding, I have to pay back by going to their wedding." Doesn't necessarily work in the same way. It is better to follow a line of conduct which serves both the living and the dead than one which serves only the living. In other words, visiting mourners is not only a comfort to them, but it's a way of honoring the dead. You go to a wedding, it's just about the living. But if you go to a shiva house, you're there for the mourners and you're also there for the memory of the dead. So it's a double kind of mitzvah, whereas for the living, only one way. It is better to follow a line of conduct which serves both rich and poor than one which serves only the rich, meaning death visits rich families as well as poor, but poor people were not able to throw the big weddings and the bashes with the 12-piece orchestra and the smorgasbord and 3 choices of food. Poor people can't do that. Whereas when you go to the house of mourning or to a funeral, you're able, whether it's rich or poor, you can do that mitzvah. It is better to follow a line of conduct in which there is consolation to be ordered to the bereaved than one in which there is no consolation to offer. You can do an incredible mitzvah by honoring, consoling the mourners and honoring the dead. You can't really do that so much. Are they going to remember you? There were 200 people at the wedding. All they care about, did you leave the envelope, with the check or the cash inside? So again, our verse was, "It is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting." And you see how the rabbis 2,000 years ago in Kohelet Rabbah interpreted it. What I want to do is to share a piece that I wrote back in 1982 that was an attempt by a young rabbi at the time to try to make sense of this sentence. So this is what I wrote. "It is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting. On a weekend in May, I officiated at a bar mitzvah, a wedding, and a funeral. By the time Monday came around, I realized that Kohelet was not the morbid, bitter man I once thought. He was simply a rabbi who had a weekend just like mine." So the first part I call the bar mitzvah. The family decided to follow the lovely tradition of throwing candy at the young man. But instead of using raisins or other such software, the family loaded up on Hershey's Kisses and hard candy. Since the day that the Jews pelted Alexander Yanai with etrogim, And again, in the Talmud, there's a story that on Sukkot, the king of the Jews, Alexander Yanai, did things that the people were very upset about. So what did they do? They went to shul, to the temple, with their lulav and etrog. The king did something. They were so upset. They took their etrogim and they threw it. They pelted him, the king, with all these etrogs. Since that day, never have so many missiles flown through a shul. If that wasn't bad enough, the bar mitzvah boy decided to throw the bags back into the congregation at his family and friends. So much for reaching the age of maturity. I had spoken to the caterer during the week about the sanctity of Shabbat, telling him what he could and could not do. He agreed to follow everything I stipulated and then went right ahead and did whatever he wanted to. Fires were lit and equipment brought into the synagogue on Shabbat. So I was faced with a no-win choice. Do I throw the scoundrel out and refuse to allow him to serve the 150 guests and penalize the family who did everything they thought proper? Or do I close my eyes, let things go on, and in doing so, be responsible for a chilul Shabbat, the desecration of the Sabbath in the shul? During the Seudah, meaning the party following the service, a gorilla came in doing magic tricks. A ventriloquist stopped by with a talking duck, and 13-year-olds tried to pop the helium balloons. After dessert, I thought, shall we do Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, or shall I just excommunicate everybody who's here? Since I had eaten a kazayit, the small amount of food that means that you now have to say the prayers, I opted for the former. I went home depressed as hell. Now we come to the wedding. Just before signing of the ketubah, the father of the groom pulled me aside. Rabbi, do me a favor. Keep it short. I smiled at him. No, I'm serious, Rabbi. My feet hurt from standing for all the pictures. No one likes a long ceremony. And don't read the ketubah. It's boring. Do a few of the Sheva Brachot and that's it. Okay? My mother brought me up to be polite, so I didn't respond to him. It dawned on me only later, during the 3 hours of dancing, that I should have told the guy I would agree to keep it short if he made the same demand of the band leader. I agreed to allow the photographer to take movies of the procession, but not the ceremony. The movie lights were so bright that a bridesmaid, momentarily blinded, bumped into a row of seats, knocking a floral arrangement onto the head of a guest. Then I gave my talk on the holiness of marriage. At the Seudah, the band leader opened with "Another One Bites the Dust," and then called on the bride's grandfather, a sweet religious man, to come up and make the motzi. Imitating the Tonight Show, he introduced the old man. "Here's Grandpa Max!" Everyone cheered. Just before the bracha, the band leader commented, "And now, a word from our sponsor, Alpo Dog Food." 5 days later, Grandpa Max suffered a heart attack. The family said it was from excessive bleeding caused when he ruptured a varicose vein. I say the wedding did it to him. After dessert, I excused myself early. And now we come to the funeral. A 41-year-old mother of 2 from cancer. I hadn't known the family at all. They were unaffiliated, but were cousins of one of my congregants. I went over to their home and sat with the husband, with the parents, and with her children. I talked a little and listened a lot. They spoke about the wife, the daughter, the mother that was now gone. There were long moments of silence and intense periods of crying. I sat down with the children, ages 12 and 8, and explained to them about funerals and cemeteries, telling them step by step what would happen. The 8-year-old told me that he hadn't slept the 2 nights since his mother's death. I told him, there's plenty to be sad about, but nothing to be afraid of. I held the hands of the woman who was about to bury her daughter, looked into her eyes, and said, "It's just not fair." She repeated my words, and more tears came. I was able to say in the eulogy something the woman had confided to her friends, but had not been able to say to her husband, how much she loved him for all the care and love he had shown her during the year of illness. I was bringing words from the dead to the living, words which would stay with her husband forever and bring him great comfort and consolation. From Kriya, tearing the ribbon, to Kaddish, from the